My name is Nat Scott. I'm the Congregational Life Director at St. Simon's Presbyterian Church in St. Simon's, Georgia. St. Simon's is a little island off the coast of Georgia. Beautiful place to live and work. But I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about art in the church. And you may start with a question of, does art belong in the church? And I laugh because, of course, art belongs in the church. Art has been a major part of the church, both what we refer to as sacred art and common art. And so those two terms are so outdated and outmoded that I almost hesitate to use them. But sacred art typically refers to the places and the spaces that we go in which to worship, whereas common art is more from the disciple side of things, where it leads us to the places where we find ourselves in worship. And so common art, though, even can be used for sacred purposes. So, like I say, those terms are just kind of limiting and outmoded. Because we live in a world today that thrives on art, it's important that we, too, begin to look at how art can find its way into everything that we do in the church. Now, later on, I'm going to do some throwing. I'm a potter and a painter and a sculptor and a photographer and someone who loves to cook. And so I love the arts in all its many forms. And so while I do focus mainly on art, through the form of pottery, I think it's important that we broaden our view as much as possible. And so I'm going to try to talk about all ways of art, but I'm going to use the act of throwing as an example of how art can be incorporated easily into the programs of your church and into the things that we do together in the life of the church. So, beginning with throwing, the very first thing that you do with a piece of clay is to take it and to push it into the center of the wheel in a process called centering. Centering is the act of taking this blobby, misshapen lump gathered out of the earth and pushing it into the place where it's no longer wobbly, it's smooth, and it's held together and it's homogeneous, and it's all held together on the center of the wheel, and it's not pushing you around. It's held in place by firm hands, pressing into it and holding pressure on from both sides so that it is in the middle, so that it's balanced, it's not wobbling off center, and it's harmonious. So that first step of centering is that it echoes of that lifelong process that we go through of being shaped by the hands of God. You know, God starts in Genesis and he talks about scooping up the handful of clay and fashioning a man out of it and then breathing life into it. And so our first encounter with clay is in the first verses of the Bible. And remember, Adamah, or Adam, the first man, means from the red earth or from the clay. So God took a lump of clay, pulled it up, and with his hands fashioned a man, and then breathed life into that man. And so, in the beginning, God used clay to express his creativity. So creation begins. And remember, going along through the Genesis story, as God's creating, it's all good, 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 until he comes to making man. And then it's very good. So we are God's highest form of art. And we need to be told that regularly. We're not something to be cast aside or thrown away. We're something to be loved and cherished and placed on a high shelf so that we know that love that God has for us is real and it's beautiful, and he adores us in the same way that we adore a fine piece of art. So centering is the very first place we're going to go. And I'll show you what centering looks like as I throw. Now, the video I'm using for throwing was actually a film made of me throwing at Montreat in North Carolina, where I serve as artist in residence for a couple of weeks each summer. I'm usually there during the Worship and Music Conference. So if you're there this summer, which we will be meeting in person, I hope you will come and visit me at the art studio, at the pottery studio. And it's a beautiful place to hang out with some great people, and we do neat stuff there. So now I'm going to show you centering. That's our So the second step for making a piece of pottery is, what we call raising the walls or growing the piece of pottery. And so what happens after you've centered the clay is you open it with your hands, and then you begin by a process of interior pressure with one hand and exterior pressure with the hand on the outside of the pot. And the clay is squeezed between that interior hand and that exterior hand. And as you squeeze, you push the clay up, and it grows magically into a cylinder. And so that process of raising the walls is an echo of really our lives in discipleship and how we are shaped, both from interior pressures. So what would our interior pressures be? Our interior pressures would be those things that are down deep, the spiritual stuff, the things that we're given as children that stay with us, all that deep down learning and information that goes in, that's poured into us from others. And that creates an interior pressure. And then you have all these things coming at you from the outside, right? So you have exterior pressure on the outside of our vessel. And so the exterior pressure that we talk about is the thing that, for instance, it can be anything. I mean, what are the things you're struggling with right now? What are the things that you're thriving on right now? All of those things are external, that from the outside, that come to us, that raise us up and meet those interior pressures and build us up. And so it's both interior pressure, those spiritual things from within, and the exterior pressure, all the things of life that come together to shape us into the person that we are and the person that we become. So God raises us up out of this lowly lump of clay, breathing life into us, and raises us up from the dust. The next thing that happens when we're making a piece of pottery is the shaping of it. What I was throwing when I was at Montreat was an amphora, which is a Greek vessel. And these were vessels that were bellied out to hold a large volume of oil or perfume or wine or water. And these were typically small on the bottom, so they could be stuck down into the sand and stacked side by side. They were usually nestled together. They had handles so that they could have ropes tied between them to hold them together. And so oftentimes they would be capped with some form of cork and then sealed with wax. So they were a good thing to hold food and make it stable, to put beans in to keep them dry, things that you would grow, grains and such. But fermentation could happen in them. You could make wine in them. So an amphora is this beautiful vessel, and so that's what I made at Montreat. Now, shaping and giving form to the thing, really to me, is the way the arts inspire us. Our lives can become fairly mechanical without it. And by that I mean, it's easy to move into a rhythm where we just do the same things over and over again. And life can become drudgery in those times. However, those things that shape us, those both interior pressures and exterior pressures, give liveliness to the form. And I love that all the Greek forms are really taken, they're often different types of body shapes. The amphora is a very fluid and wavy kind of shape, and it's fairly female in form, almost pregnant female. And so I love that container, vessel, life that the amphora represents. There's a girl that I do liturgical art with at our church, and she and I talk about these kinds of things all the time. Now, a lot of folks think we're weird because when we get together, those are the things we talk about. But that shaping, that growing, and that giving life or new life and shape is that act of imbuing a simple form with life, with new life. And so the amphora and the shaping that it goes through is this beautiful process of bringing this simple shape, and just through a few little acts of pressure and tension with my hands, I form this now beautiful shape. And it goes from a fairly mundane cylinder into this bellied out and beautiful form. And that is life. That is life in its fullness. Recognizing that even in the mundane times, we are being shaped. It's gentle, it's slow, happens over a long period of time. But to look back on your life and say, look where I was back 10 years ago and 20 years ago. What do I know now that's different? What has shaped me in new ways so that I'm better for it? Those kinds of things give beauty to life and real meaning. So shaping takes place both internally and externally, and people see it and they are astonished by it. So when they see that beauty, and I'm not just talking about aesthetic beauty, they see the depth of beauty that is the God shaping coming out for everyone to see. Aesthetics, yes, but more than that. There's a real spiritual nature to art. I love this vessel form that we're talking about because it lends itself so well to teaching. Because isn't this what God does with us? Shaping us, molding us. And there are times when we resist. We push back against his hands. We resist the form we're being pushed into. We don't necessarily like it. And yet, looking back over your life, I guess you'd probably agree with me that the things that made you who you are often those hard places that we resisted. We didn't want to go through them. Think about this. None of us asked for this pandemic, but I'm certain that many of you, like me, actually found some beauty in it. There were times where I actually spent time doing little mundane things and enjoying them that I would never have done otherwise. So, resistance, that's part of it. But also embracing and allowing God to have his way with us. That's beautiful. I think that's art. So, having finished throwing the piece, there's a period where you have to let things sit and firm up. And as you wait for that to happen, it's usually just overnight. But it can be a lot quicker if you've got wind blowing and other outside forces like heat. Um, and basically what you want to do is this soft, mushy piece of clay needs to dry to the point that it's got what we call in the ceramic world leather hardness. It's still malleable, slightly bendable, a little bit wet, but not wet to the touch. It feels a little cold, but the clay is firm and it has the ability to be carved. Now, it's at this point that you do things like finish shaping the piece, because at some point when you're throwing the piece, it becomes too wet to do any more with. You've stretched it out to the as far as it'll go, and made the most out of the piece of clay that you've got. And once you have that basic form made, then you let it firm up, and then you turn it upside down, put it back on the wheel, and you use a set of tools to trim it and to make it into the shape that you want it to be, the final shape that you want it to be. Now, trimming is reductive work. You're actually removing. And I like to think of this as those places that we go through in our lives where we look at the things that we really don't like about ourselves, and we examine them, and we determine that they don't belong, and we carefully cut them away. Sometimes they're cut away from us whether we want them or not. Sometimes we have to have a doctor cut them away. But the truth is that reductive process is going on throughout our life. We are always lumpy and bumpy and all misshapen. And by that I mean we're not falling into that beautiful shape that God is making us into. Perhaps we've resisted His hand. And perhaps there's some things that we've decided on our own that we want to try, and maybe they led us down a dark path, and whatever it may be, those places need to be trimmed away. And so that is just a beautiful act, and I love the reductive work of trimming. I love carving a piece of cool, wet, slightly wet clay. I love cutting into it with a nice sharp tool, and just letting the ribbons of clay fall away. It's just a beautiful process, and I really like that, and I embrace it. But the spiritual side of it is that it's tough and it's hard on us. The reductive work is hard. Again, back to that, the things that are the best that we embrace in our lives, the best places of us, were never easy. I take folks on outings, doing kayak trips and stuff. There's a fun thing we do in summer. Every year we go out to a little island called Sapelo. We kayak for 4 days, and we do a lot of hiking around in the maritime forest. And when I take groups out there, the first thing we do on the first day is to determine what the group is up for. And so we do this really hard hike out through the marsh on what's called the Old Road, and it's this old trail that went out through the woods that's been overgrown now. It's buggy. There's a lot of stickers and all kinds of stuff like that. There's nettles, there's stinging nettles, there's cactuses, there's deep mud. And so on a particular day, I had taken this group out, and there was a footbridge that's one plank of wood, and it goes over this little inlet where Cabrera, this river, runs through, and as it breaks away, it makes these little tiny tributaries through the marsh. And this is one of those tributaries, and it's maybe 3 feet wide and 3 feet deep, and on both sides it's something called pluff mud, which is a black mud that if it gets on your clothes, they're stained forever. It's got a lot of biological matter in it that's decayed over time, and so all that to say, this is a mucky, muddy hole, and there's a bridge over it. Unfortunately, when we got there, the bridge was gone. Now, at that point, we were several miles into the hike. It was 100 degrees on that particular day. We were almost to the beach. We could hear the water over the dune on the other side. And the only things that we could do were to turn around and go back on the trail that we had just come from. Or we could power through that marsh, because our bridge was gone. The bridge was out, no way to get to the other side except through the mud. So one of my brave little girls looked at me and she goes, "I'll go first." And she just dove straight down in, splashed through the mud, came up on the other side and pulled herself up on the roots. And so I was like, way to go. And then her brothers were like, "Oh," and these are not her little brothers, her big brothers. And so they stepped out and both of them got stuck up to their necks in mud. And so there were others, the same thing. We managed to get everybody through and onto the other side. And when we're all standing over there, we're all laughing, we're all covered up to our necks in mud. We're literally just soppy, sloppy, wet, caked in mud. And we just plowed straight out to the beach as fast as we could. And we ran and just dove into the ocean. And all of us just sat out there in that warm, beautiful ocean and splashed around and cleaned all the mud off of ourselves. And we were so grateful to be out of those woods. And so I asked everybody, I said, "So, do y'all want to go the 2 miles back through that mucky mud, or do you want to do the 5-mile walk around to the sand road and go back?" And they were like, "Give me the 5 miles. We're not going back through there." But at the end of the trip, I asked everybody, what was your favorite part? And going around the circle, everybody said the same thing. "Oh, going through that mud hole. That was the funnest thing ever." And I'm like, "Oh, that was not the comments that I heard when you were going through it." But that's the truth. Our lives are so much like that. When we look back, it's the hardship, that shaping, that cutting away. All of that hardship is what brings life. And really, those are the points that we look back and go, thank God. And that's really what we're doing. We're thanking God for walking through that mud hole with us. So when we're trimming a piece of pottery and bringing it to its final shape, that is really what we're doing. We are honoring what that piece can become. And that's who we are. We are honoring God by becoming what He's shaping us into, even through the hardship. Amen. So in closing, I would like to just revisit talking about art in the church. And there are artists among us. It's important that we know who those folks are. And so even in the smallest churches, you can ask and seek and find out who's making art in your church, and invite them in. Liturgical arts, including the things that you make, like paraments and even stoles for the pastors. The communion sets can be made of clay or blown glass. And so you may have artists sitting in your pews that you have no idea, but ask and find out and find ways to incorporate them. I've been asked many times to come to churches, beyond our own, to do workshops where I'll bring my potter's wheel and set up and do the stories of the Bible in clay. And there's clay throughout Scripture. So, like I said, beginning in Genesis, you've got Jeremiah, you've got all the rich passages of, even leading up to the terrible things like the potter's field. There are numerous places to incorporate art, both either as object lessons or as ways that we can bring people together. It's fun to do, especially if you've got a painter in the church, to bring folks together and let them paint together. There are really fun ways to gather, and really creativity is unlimited. I like what a friend of mine who is deceased now, his name was Sasha Makovkin. He was a great potter and a preacher too. And he said that anytime someone says, "Oh, I'm not creative," he would immediately turn on them and say, "Oh, but that's blasphemy, because we are made in the image of the great Creator. And if that's true, then we are nothing if not creative." And so creativity can be brought to light in all kinds of ways in your churches. And seek them out. Seek the people that are sitting in your pews. They may be artists of the visual nature, as those that I've described. They may be performing artists, all the musicians and dancers, which are an absolute godsend when you have those in your worship services. So really, creativity is only limited when we put limits on it. So feel free to explore the arts. And I encourage you to do that. And I offer myself also as someone to consult with. If you want great ideas, my wife and I are both artists, and so we love sharing ideas and things that we've experienced with churches, and especially small churches. My first church was a very small church. And now I'm in a larger church that has several people on staff, and so it's easier in those situations. But you can't be feel limited in a small church, because there are so many great things that can happen in a smaller church. Everybody knows everybody, and that's wonderful. So I love to help out small churches, and I would love to help your church. So feel free to give me a call anytime. I will include my information so that you can email me and we can get in touch and talk. So, as I've said, the arts are a blessing that we've been given by God and that we share with one another to enrich our lives and to make things better. And so I pray this for all of you, that you will find your way into the arts and find the artists among you and let them help you to worship God in fullness and in spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.